Each month we get together, we eat great food, we have camaraderie, and we have some kind of extraordinary speaker. And tonight will certainly be no exception. I will let Scott do most of the introduction of himself, but from what I know, Scott is both a permaculturist and also a food system expert and advocate. He is the kind of national and international expert that gets drawn to MUM. He's teaching a block at MUM, and how many students, Scott students here? Many of us feel like our agricultural system is in crisis, and because of that, our health is in crisis. Everything is all wrapped up together. So Scott's going to help us understand food and food security and permaculture from a systems. Okay, Scott Vlaun.
All right. It's really an honor to be here. This is my fourth trip to Fairfield, fourth permaculture class, and it's just, the community just seems to build and build every time. First time I was here was a year ago, May. I was here with Phil Hawes, and we were doing a tour of the Eco Village, and we got a chance to look at this space. And it didn't look all that promising. It looked kind of like maybe it was going to be resurrected, maybe it was going to be torn down kind of vibe to it. And what they've done with it here is amazing. And I was really happy to bring our students out here last year and kind of put some love into the place. So it's kind of becoming a little home. And this community is kind of becoming a second community for me too. And it's really an honor. So how did I get here? So I'm an art major. Like, I studied art in college, and I have a master's degree in photography. And soon after I finished my photography degree, I got involved kind of randomly. Somebody said, "Hey, we need somebody to take pictures of plants. Can you do that?" And I'm like, sure. I was like all into postmodernism and semiotics and kind of crazy stuff, but I used to photograph plants a lot because I was an Edward Weston fan when I was a kid, and I had a garden. I was a gardener, and I went out in my garden, took some pictures of some plants, showed them to them. They're like, "When can you leave?" And I started traveling all over the West photographing plants for a seed company called Seeds of Change, which was the first real organic seed company in this country that had some muscle. They had the Mars Corporation behind them. And they sent me to probably about 100 organic farms over the course of about 8 or 10 years of traveling and photographing. And from the very first trip, I realized that the food system was incredibly broken, and these organic farmers that I was working with, these seed farmers, were heroes, and they were trying to change the food system and trying to save our genetic heritage, and they were my teachers and mentors. So then after that, I did that for a long time. I moved back to Maine, and right when I moved to Maine, the company and my partner at the time was a graphic designer. We were both freelancing for the company, and they said, "Would you just take on the seed catalog?" And we worked on their seed catalog and their website, and we really just were full on in organic seeds for a long time. And then things kind of came unglued a little bit, and at that point we really decided that like local was the new organic, and we decided to make a stand in Norway, Maine, where I live, and we started this organization called the Center for an Ecology-Based Economy. And it's really a climate action organization, but we work in the areas of energy and shelter and transportation, and food is like probably our biggest sector that we work in. We're one of the network of community food councils in Maine. We throw this huge festival every summer with about 2,000 people to celebrate local food, and we're just working as hard as we can to build a local food system in much the way that you guys are here, because I really feel like building a local food system in community is probably our best hope for kind of threading this needle of 10 billion people and the perils of industrial agriculture. And to see what you guys are doing here in this space and building community like this, spaces like this are super valuable for this movement. For people can come together and talk about this stuff and start to share information. And so I'm going to share some information tonight. I could retitle this talk like "The Things That Keep Me Up at Night" and "The Things That Let Me Go Back to Sleep." So I'm going to start with the things that keep me up, and we're going to get that stuff out of the way. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what permaculture is, because inevitably I think people have an opinion about permaculture that's not always true. And then I'm going to take you on some excellent adventures with all of these students over here that we've had some really fun times north of here into the upper Midwest, seeing some scaled up like 100-acre permaculture sites. So here we go. If this works. I just skipped one. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk about challenges. So these are some of our food system challenges. I wouldn't say these are all of them, but a big one is that our whole food system is based on non-renewable inputs. Oil, phosphorus, all that kind of stuff. Soil erosion, aquifer depletion, toxic runoff. Where I come from in Maine, ocean fisheries, ocean warming and fisheries collapse is a huge deal. The Gulf of Maine fishery has just basically collapsed. Things that we take for granted. We're not even going to have lobsters in 20 years in Maine. So if you want lobsters, come soon. Food miles, everybody knows our food travels, 1,500, 2,000 miles to get to us, which all of this is adding up to a huge carbon footprint for our food industry, as well as the fact that we're growing these vast monocultures. The GMO thing is kind of a little off the rails, and we're losing our genetic heritage as we go. So, like Bob mentioned, we're talking about a food system, but we're really going to talk mostly about production tonight. But just the amount of fossil fuels in our food system is partially because of this cycle here. It takes a lot of, to produce the food, but then distribution, the processing, the marketing. We spend billions and billions of dollars marketing this stuff, that goes around getting it to stores, preparation, consumption, and then back to waste recovery, where 40% of what starts up there ends up wasted up here. So this is a broken system in a lot of ways, and I think we've got some ideas about how we might be able to unbreak it. Sam James, who teaches at MUM, who sent me this morning, and this is in Bloomberg News. It's a really interesting little infographic that they put up, and it's about how the United States land use works out. Everything that's yellow there is all grazing, pasture, and rangeland. Everything that's in brown is all cropland. And then the green stuff is all forest. The pink things are all the cities. The people are all in the cities. And more people are moving to the cities. And leaving this vast area of natural resources, about 80% of our country, to be managed, and increasingly by corporations instead of people. And corporations have, by nature, they're not ethically inclined to take a long-range view. They're like 5-year plan. And so the corporations are there to make money for their shareholders by law, really. That's their job. And when we turn over our natural resources to corporations, I feel like, it's maybe not the best approach to managing our land. So what we end up with is kind of a mining operation. We're mining natural resources to create wealth, and that wealth is being consolidated out of our communities into the hands of a few people. So you can't talk about food without talking about oil. We pretty much are drinking oil every day. Every one of us that buys food from the industrial food system is responsible for a little over a gallon of oil every day that's pumped out of the earth. So that's 400 gallons a year per person in the United States. Other parts of mostly the global north, it's that's somewhere between 200 to 400 gallons a year. The global south, there's places where that might be like 0 or 1 or 5. Or we don't need to grow our food with fossil fuels, but because it's so cheap and because it's incredible concentrated energy, we can do a lot of work with it. So this, many of you probably have heard of Hubbert's curve, but Hubbert predicted the peak oil for the United States back in the 70s, and he was pretty much bang on, and we peaked out on production, and then it tailed off. And he also he predicted world oil peak production around the early part of the 2000s. And it sort of happened, and but according to Hubbert, it would have tailed off. But we figured out how to extend that out. And my friend John Howe was one of those peak oil guys. And he said, you know what, Scott, I'll just throw you another 500 billion barrels. And we're still kind of heading for disaster here. So that blue line is population growth, which is probably going to top out at about 10 billion people. And the red line is, what's going to happen to crude oil in the current scenario. And what John would call that space in between there is the hunger gap. We're feeding the world right now with fossil fuels, at least the part of it that we're responsible for, the industrial food system, when in fact, really 70% of the world is being fed by small-scale localized agriculture. This industrial model is really, if they say they're feeding the world, it's really a lie. There's 1 billion hungry people in this world. There's hungry people here in Fairfield. The industrial food system is failing to feed the world, but is concentrating huge amounts of profits with mining our natural resources. And we're using fossil fuel to do it. And if we don't figure out another way to grow food without all this fossil fuel, obviously that's not a pretty picture there. How do we extend that red curve? We just frack. We figured out this fracking thing. That's a fracking well. I'm preaching to the choir here, I realize, but I always feel like there's maybe somebody that hasn't gotten wind of what's going on. They drill these wells. Every one of those red dots is a truck, a semi-trailer truck that rolls through some town into some field, and they start building these wells where they pump fluid with all sorts of chemicals into the earth under high pressure, and they fracture the earth so they can extract resources out of it. There's another. They're pretty, like the really cool, like beautiful trucks, and these are white trucks with red. But it's like just incredibly destructive thing, and the thing is these wells die out after like a year or two, and they just keep doing more and more and more. They just keep running them across the landscape because it's the only way they can continue to extract money off of this. And some of this has just been losing money forever, but they still do it because it's what we do, and America's going to be oil independent, damn it. And this is the Yates oil field down in Texas. There's a fracking well every 5 acres. And by all accounts, this was like an incredibly beautiful place. This is like the Permian Basin out there in West Texas, like incredibly beautiful place. We're just kind of like raping the earth to keep the fossil fuel flowing. This is the Canadian tar sands, right? See the little trucks, those little trucks coming down the road? Those are the size of this building. I mean, maybe not quite that big. They're the size of a 3-story house. This is this is Mordor. This is like the giant open pit mine of tar. This is why we want to build the KXL pipeline, to get this tar mixed with a bunch of chemicals and pump it into the United States so we can refine it and sell it somewhere else so oil companies can make a ton of money. It happens to be right on the edge of this is a Canadian boreal forest. That's the Athabasca River. These things are putting out so much pollution, it's hard to even keep track of, but now they're finding lots of mercury around here. And the mercury is all getting into this water, and downstream is the First Nation communities. Quick story, the guy who took those last 2 pictures, his name is Garth Lenz. He came to Portland, Maine to talk about this project with some native people from that First Nation community. And he said when he wanted to go take a boat up the river, and he borrowed a boat from one of the First Nation guys, and the guy told him, whatever you do, just don't eat the fish. And he's like, okay, he's like, well, because it's all contaminated with all this runoff. And he comes back, and then the whole community is eating the fish because they have no other food, really. This is their sustenance. This is their whole, it's sort of like it's in their DNA to eat salmon. So why are we doing this to the earth, right? It's like, it seems so crazy that we're doing this, but this is how we grow our food. It's the brute force of fossil fuel. It's the only way you can do what we're doing out here, is with just giant machines, and these things take a lot of money, a lot of oil to make and to run and to maintain. It's like and to ship around. These things get carted all over the place. They don't like sit in one place. So it's like a huge fossil fuel intensive thing. And this is like classic monoculture stuff. One thing we notice whenever I take the students up, we're always driving through this. Obviously, we drive from here to Wisconsin and Minnesota, and we're driving through, not so much flat like this, but it's a little more rolling, but same idea, corn and soy. And we always notice see the little breaks in the pattern? This is like this perfect pattern here of straight lines, but there's all these little breaks. Well, those are either super weeds that have developed resistance to this herbicide they use called Roundup, or they're corn plants from the last harvest, because the corn is also resistant. So they have to go out and pull all the corn plants out by hand so they can harvest the soybeans without getting corn in the soybeans. the weeds now are starting to get really resistant to this herbicide called Roundup, which is glyphosate, which they're finding in pretty much everybody's got it. You've got it in your body, the residue from it. Now they're finding that the residue affects our gut bacteria. So it doesn't hurt human cells, but it hurts bacteria, which we are all carrying around about 3 pounds of it, which regulates all kinds of stuff in our body we don't even know about. But now it's not even working. So they had to go to something even better. Or, yeah. The new standard for weed control, exceptional, easy to use, tolerance to 2,4-D, glyphosate and glufosinate in a singular molecular stack. Like, how can you resist? Look at this, it kills everything except for the soybean plant. It's like genius. This is like the miracles of modern science here. I just worry about the other stuff that's all dying here. This is what the EPA says about it. It says 2,4-D generally has moderate toxicity to birds and mammals, is slightly toxic to fish and aquatic invertebrates, and is practically non-toxic to honeybees. Practically non-toxic, and this is passed now. They said this is okay. However, the ester forms of 2,4-D can be highly toxic to fish and other aquatic life. This is our EPA that wrote that and then said, go ahead, let it rip, because the other stuff's not working. So to keep this thing rolling, we've got to get stronger and stronger herbicides. And this is a treadmill that we're not going to get off of. The same idea of resistance, building up resistance, can be used the other way around, and we'll talk about that later. Everybody here knows what this is. Well, maybe not. This is Iowa. It's not modern art. This is pivot irrigation, right? It's these things that are, all throughout the Midwest, Kansas, even this one's up in Idaho. This is kind of a new thing. This is an infrared satellite photograph of Garden City, Kansas from 1970-something and 2000-something, 2015. And you can see, there's a lot of squares over here and there's a lot of circles over there. So to get the yields, to keep increasing yields, which is the bread and butter of industrial agriculture, greater yields, how many bushels per acre, that's like the gold standard. That's pretty much what we care about. We don't care about the quality so much as the quantity. We pump more water, we can get more yield. And if we have cheap fossil fuel, we can drill wells and we can pump water from deep down, from fossil aquifers, and grow more stuff. However, these fossil aquifers are dropping. They're kind of like fossil water, so there's less and less water to pump all the time. These aquifers are dropping. In some places where they're closer to the surface, the whole land is dropping. There's places in California where they used to be able to run flood irrigation, and the ponds they have dropped to the point where now it's uphill and they can't irrigate anymore from it. You can do this anywhere, essentially. This is Jordan. I mean, they're drilling wells 2,000 feet deep and growing alfalfa. Because you can have some chemical fertilizers and some water, and you can pretty much grow this stuff anywhere. You can grow it right in a desert. And I've seen this in New Mexico, in southern New Mexico, in places where, they're in severe drought. The whole Southwest is looking at it in, long drought. And I've seen stuff that looks kind of like this down there. Put enough water and chemicals on the ground, you can make this happen. So the result of this is aquifers are depleted. And this map just kind of shows how the aquifers in the country, we're good up here. We get plenty of rain. We don't have to irrigate, all that stuff. But a big part of our food system, however, does pump a lot of water. And when that water runs out, not so good. And then, of course, there's this climate change. I don't know if anybody's read the newest report that just came out the other day, 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're just not doing a darn thing about climate change, really. Baby steps. When we need this to be like, World War II, the Victory Gardens, the moonshot. We need this to be like the biggest thing that humanity's tackling right now. It's like 14th on people's radar in terms of issues. To me, this is like the number one issue. And I see it where I live. The old timers see it. You see it we just went on this field trip. Every single place we went was like, we've never seen this much rain at once, like ever. This is unprecedented. There's no unrecorded history. The next place we went, we had 8 tornadoes in the last 3 weeks. We've never had a tornado here before. And then we're riding home, and the whole thing was going on in Florida. It's like climate's going crazy, and it's going to affect our food security for sure. It already is. This is Hurricane Irene in Vermont. Vermont had a hurricane, washed away like whole farms, just washed down rivers and blew out all those pretty covered bridges, and they're still recovering from that. North Carolina, hog CAFOs underwater. Look at the color of the water. It's nasty. They don't let the pigs out anymore when they have these floods because they don't want the pictures, the aerial photographs, which you can find online from other hurricanes. Really bad press, so they don't do that anymore, so you don't see pigs floating around in there. I don't know what that is coming out of that thing, but it can't be good. And then there's just these rain events. Our precipitation is coming in bigger pulses now. In Maine, where I live, we get 75% more extreme weather events than we did 50 years ago. And this is just measured by more than 2 inches of rain in 24 hours. That's an extreme weather event. And we get that 75% of the time. And it's pretty much like all we get now, it seems like. Either pours or we have drought. And I know it's been going on, the same thing's been going on here too. Extended droughts, crazy heat, and then crazy rains. The last place when we went up to Roald Gunderson's place, we drove our van in, the road washed out that night behind us because he got 2 inches of rain overnight in like an hour. And we barely got out of there. We thought we were all going to have to start hauling rocks to get us out. And the poor guy had just fixed his road, from another crazy flood. So these floods are, obviously there's a corn crop in the field. When you get a flood like this, and this has been fertilized, all that fertility is washing into the watershed, right? It's going into ditches, going into streams, going into rivers, and it's taken nitrates and phosphorus with it. And this is a little map of nitrate levels by watershed, and interestingly, they track with like the meat processing facilities. You look up in Iowa here, we've got Tyson, those blue ones, those little teardrops are all Tyson meat processing plants. And you can see the watersheds here. I mean, everybody knows that Iowa, there's no safe water in the watersheds. And it's not just Iowa, but boy, we sure do seem like we're in the epicenter of it up here.
49th worst water in the country, Iowa.
49th worst water in the country. So where's all the water go? It goes down the river to the ocean, right? And this isn't just here. We're not alone. This is all over the world. So this is a map that shows the mouth of most of the major rivers in the world, some of the minor rivers. Those red dots are dead zones, where they're seasonal dead zones. The yellow dots are where there's a lot of pollution, no dead zone yet. The blue dots are the estuaries that are in pretty decent shape. Dead zone is where nothing will grow. This is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Seasonal dead zone, it usually happens with the growing season, sort of towards the end of the growing season. All that fertility that we're making, a lot of it we're either mining from phosphorus mines or we're making it from natural gas through this process that makes nitrogen fertilizer, and it ends up down in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's dead. It just goes hypoxic. All the oxygen goes out of the water and nothing can live there. So when I start thinking about stuff like this, and I think about the fact that this is from mostly growing plants on the land. This isn't necessarily from animals, although we're growing the plants to feed animals. It's like we could all be vegetarian, and if we have bad agriculture, we're still going to have these problems. So I get a little twitchy about we all have to stop eating meat right now or the planet's going to die. And I'm going to keep talking about this throughout the thing, that we can actually use animal agriculture to regenerate this problem instead of this way that we're doing it now. So then there's the drought side of it. A lot of our major agricultural areas around the world are having droughts. This is northern China. They've had a drought kind of like California had. This was a couple of years ago. And they're also pumping their groundwater, and their groundwater is dropping. So eventually they're going to run out of water. And China, they had it going on for 4,000 years. Sustainable agriculture, when they adopted this industrial model, things kind of went awry. That's the California drought. I just love that picture. It was from the New York Times a few years ago. And you can see the cloud of soil going up. Here's another one. This is actually Maine. We had a drought in 2016 in Maine, and topsoil was just going all over the place. So this is a soil erosion issue. In the spring, in agricultural areas, we tend to till the ground till it's bare. This was flying into Des Moines in May when I came out here at the plane window. We're making some strides. We're doing this thing with the buffer zones now. The NRCS is paying farmers to put these little buffer, what do you call them? Buffer strips, thank you. So that when the water runs down into these drainages, it actually gets filtered somewhat by the grass. Extreme weather events, these just turn into streams, and I think the grass does next to nothing once it gets further down. But it's hopeful, and it's kind of beautiful when we're driving up up the highway there to the driftless. You see these all over the place, and these are perennial, so they're not tilling that little spot, but most of it gets tilled. This, what am I doing? This is a soil erosion map. It's back data from 1997. Hopefully we're a little better now, but all the places in red there are losing the dark red, over 8 tons of topsoil per acre per year. That's a lot of soil. Even a ton, the green stuff is all losing, around a ton or less, but there's still soil erosion going on. But any place that's got slopey ground where you start tilling, you're going to lose soil. It's just gravity and water. It flows downhill, and it's an issue. It's an issue for the country, and the USDA, the NRCS know it, and they're doing what they can. But to change the entire model, to not lose soil, to build soil, is not in the cards just yet. I mentioned the Gulf of Maine. This is Maine shrimp. There are no more Maine shrimp. Can't get a Maine shrimp roll anymore. Hasn't been a season now for 3 years, and there never will be in our lifetimes. This used to be my staple diet when I was in college. During certain months of the year, you could get 5 pounds of shrimp for a couple bucks. So the fisheries that we've relied on are in a lot of trouble in a lot of places too. This is the rainforest and what's called the Cerrado in South America that we're basically clearing some crazy, like 18 million acres a year to grow soybeans. This is a little time-lapse thing I found online. This is an aerial photograph, or it's a satellite photograph, and this was the next year. Come on, baby. The next year, they found these are like 40-acre little soybean plots, and a year later, it looked like that. And this is going on all over. They had a moratorium on cutting down the rainforest to grow soybeans. And it worked pretty well. And then they just moved over to this other area. And this is kind of continuing. It's slowing down. The amount that they're cutting every year is slowing down, but it's not reversing by any means. This is the lungs of the earth. There's a lot of carbon in those trees. And we're growing soybeans. And why are we growing soybeans in South America? It's so the global north can have food. And a big part of food, this whole food security, food justice thing is the global north's got a land grab going on in South America right now. Any arable land down there, these corporations are sucking that land up, and they're displacing a lot of native people who may have been able to just forage off of that, in that jungle, in that cerrado. May have been able to eat bushmeat and forage for vegetables and fruits, and maybe have little milpas in the country. So we end up with this. I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, so we're feeding soybeans to cows and corn so we can have, and you can see that kind of calls out some of the companies there. And it's so we can do this, right? We can jam a bunch of pigs in a spot in a confined place. We can feed them, and we can fatten them up really fast because they're not moving around. They're not wasting a lot of stuff. They get sick. We inject them full. We have all the modern, medicine to keep these things alive. And that's the way we're kind of growing our food. That's how we grow chickens, right? Put 50,000 chickens in a barn and raise them for 7 weeks and try to keep them alive and then slaughter them, or then feedlots. So that's kind of that cycle, and that's the stuff that kind of keeps me up. It's like, well, how can we keep sustaining this? It's not sustainable. It's completely like it's a mining operation, right? So take a deep breath. Let's talk about opportunities. All right. Sorry about the news, but it's, I don't know, just feel like it's my job. So regenerative organic practices, what is that? It's the buzzword, it's the new organic, it's the new sustainable, everything's regenerative now, right? You can find regenerative, just about anything. And we'll just talk a little bit about what that is. We're talking about cycling nutrients, keeping them back in the system, retaining them in the system so they're not flowing down the rivers into the ocean. We're talking about taking the carbon out of the air instead of releasing it through our agriculture and releasing it from all those trees and soil and using all that fossil fuel. We're talking about sequestering carbon back into the soil. We're talking about, instead of bushels per acre or calories per acre, we're talking about growing nutrition per acre. The food that we're growing isn't really fit for human consumption, even though we're feeding it to animals, but a lot of it we are feeding to people, and it's like food, right? Food-like substances. So we can grow nutrition per acre. We have to relocalize our food system. I mean, that's like shipping food from Mexico to Maine is insane. My co-op 10 years ago had salad greens from California all spring long before I finally started a salad greens business because I couldn't stand it anymore. It's hard work, but we can grow salad in Maine all year round, basically. We have to rebuild our biodiversity. I mean, every place we've cleared for agriculture, those places, that was the thought I lost. In the rainforest down there, if you cut down 10 acres of rainforest to grow soybeans, not only have you taken all these trees out of the system and all this carbon, you've probably rendered 100 species extinct. I mean, there are species of animals and insects and birds that just live in a tiny little part of that. And we're worried about, chickens. The sixth great extinction is on us. And we're fighting over, the wrong stuff. We have to reduce food waste. I talked about that 40% food waste thing. That's enough waste to feed the billion starving people in the world, right there. If we just get the waste out of the system, we can feed everybody. And we have to regenerate the farming communities. I mean, you drive through the Midwest, it's like ghost town after ghost town because we don't have enough farmers anymore. The farmers are all those kids are gone, the people have, retired out, and the corporations are just taking over the land and running it into the ground. And these communities are all suffering, so. But what if we had an agriculture like the Chinese had for centuries that was sustainable, and they could grow food on the same land over and over? I just threw that in there because I think it's beautiful. Obviously, Iowa's never going to look like that, but that's China, and that's all over. That's all over Mesoamerica too. You go to Peru. That's how the Incas farmed. They farmed in the mountains. They were sustainable for generation after generation after generation. It wasn't until World War II that we had all these leftover chemicals, and we said, well, what are we going to do with them? We'll just dump them on our food. And we had all this oil, and we just let's grow food with oil, and everybody can watch television. All right, so what's permaculture? And how can it help us kind of get out of this mess? So, as it sounds, permaculture started out as permaculture, permanent agriculture, right? Instead of this seasonal cycle, we're going to just do permanent agriculture. We're going to grow perennial crops, and we're going to harvest off those. And then it's kind of become more about permanent culture. It's not about agriculture. It's not techniques. It's not anything. It's a design system. So this is, I'll just leave it. So that Bill Mollison, David Holmgren were the founders of the permaculture. They coined the phrase. They wrote the first book. It's a design system. It's about creating sustainable human environments. And it's about working with rather than against nature. It's not about killing stuff to grow our crops. It's about figuring out how nature works. Bill Mollison spent a lot of time. He was a logger. spent a lot of time in the woods, and he would just look at these natural systems and go, this is the most productive thing I've ever seen. Why can't we tweak this and make it productive for us as well? David Holmgren took this to the next phase of from sustainable agriculture to sustainable culture. There's a big social permaculture movement now. A lot of the principles that you'll see relate to how we work together as humans in community. And it's first and foremost, my students are probably so sick of hearing this, but it's an ethical design tool. This is really an ethical movement, and it's about creating sustainability through integrating diversity, stability, and resilience. But it's first and foremost, it's about ethics. And when anybody teaches permaculture or talks about permaculture, the first thing they talk about are the 3 ethics. Some people the movement is sort of getting a few more ethics, but right on top is earth care. Care of the earth is the first permaculture ethic. So every decision we make in a permaculture design, first thing we have to say is, how are we caring for the earth? What is the consequences of the earth? Then it's people care, on the right. I love that little graphic there. It's like, if you look at it long enough, it flips back and forth for you. So we have to care for people. We have to care for ourselves. If we don't care for ourselves, how can we do the work that we need to do to care for the earth? We have to care for our kin. We have to care for the people around us, people that we're in community with. The blue one is fair share. Earth care, people care, fair share. It's like the mantra of permaculture. And the fair share ethic, again, it comes out of observing nature. Nature, there's no surplus, there's no hoarding. Surplus that's generated in nature goes back. A tree produces a zillion leaves. They all just go back into the system. A tree produces tons of fruit. It gets eaten, it gets, squirrels will take acorns and try to hoard them, but, they can't keep track of all that stuff. If they don't eat it, it just makes more oak trees, or it just rots and becomes worm food or whatever. So there's no waste in nature. And we kind of feel like maybe there's enough to go around, and if that little slice of that pie could get a little bigger for everyone and a little less for some, that we'd have a much more sustainable system to begin with, and a lot of people would be in a better position to be helping solve these problems. So there's the ethics, and then there's these design principles. There's a number of them. These are David Holmgren's 12. If you really want to dig into permaculture a little bit, I highly recommend this website. It's called permacultureprinciples.com. My favorite part is there's a song for every principle that are really good and really informative. Like if you just listen to the songs, you'll get permaculture. You don't even have to read anything. You don't have to look at any pictures. Just listen to the songs, and they're very danceable. And then there's other things that aren't here, like the idea of stacking functions, the idea of the problem is the solution. There's all these little permaculture principle mantras, and not going to get into all that here, but you'll start to see it. So if you have water that's potentially going to get contaminated, your drinking water, you've got a couple solutions. The city of Portland, Maine gets their water from Sebago Lake. Sebago Lake's pretty darn clean, but the water's starting to get a little dirtier. They need to build water filtration. Their other option is to pay people through the land trust system all along the Crooked River, which feeds their reservoir, to not cut down the trees, to leave it forested. Because trees can do the same work as all that bricks and mortar and all the fossil fuels it's going to take to build and run that thing. If we just let the trees do their job, we've got clean water. So our land trust and all the land trusts along that river are getting money from the Portland Water District, and they're paying landowners, or they're buying up tracts of this riparian land, and they're leaving it to filter the water. That's a slow, natural solution versus a expensive, high input solution. So permaculture designers can take this idea in a smaller scale, and they can say, well, what does a river do? It swirls the water around and it runs it through plants, so we can build flow forms and move the water around and aerate it, and then we can run it through plants and purify it. So a permaculture designer might take a look at this drawing by Ernst Haeckel of a radiolane. It's a little tiny diatom in the sea, and study that and go, wow, look at how that thing built that structure with this tiny little shell. It's a very minimal amount of material. Built this structure that can get tossed around in the ocean using hexagons and pentagons. And then they could be the next Buckminster Fuller and come up with something like that. That's how Bucky Fuller figured out the geodesic dome, was by observing nature. So we observe nature. We observe the branching patterns of like a riverine estuary and how that water gets collected and distributed, and we might use that to design a community food forest, that same pattern, that branching pattern. So we're just constantly inspired by natural patterns and the way nature works. So what's a food forest? A food forest is what we call a perennial polyculture. We use perennial plants. We grow them together in a polyculture as opposed to monoculture. We have annual monoculture is what we're doing. Maybe perennial polyculture is a better solution. So we create guilds of plants, just different plants that work together, specific to your zone, your soils, your conditions. Different amount of species, up to, can have just 2 species, could be a polyculture, or it could be, a dozen. The idea here is that every season this is going to reduce our inputs. We're not going to have to till, we're not going to have to fertilize, we're not going to have to spray herbicides, all that stuff. Ideally, we're going to end up in a situation where we're just foraging. We'll build systems where we can forage for our food. We can have perennial grains that we could still use a combine, or we could still use some mechanization, but it dramatically will reduce our inputs, although it's going to cost us some labor up front. This brings me to the 4th permaculture ethic of the transitional ethic, where we've got a lot of embodied energy in this system already, right? We've invested tons of fossil fuels to build all this equipment, and we can still use it, but we just have to kind of wind that down. We don't want to waste all that. So we'll still be able to use some of that. And then we're talking about long-term productivity. Just had chestnuts tonight that these folks made in that quinoa. And those chestnut trees that they got the chestnuts off of, they're going to be there for hundreds of years. And anything you can do with a chestnut, anything you can do with corn or wheat, you can basically do with a chestnut. And you don't have to do anything, and they're beautiful, and they provide all kinds of other functions. And there's another thing about using perennials is you think about where your corn plants are in the summer solstice, at least in Maine, we're knee-high by the 4th of July, we're pretty good shape. So summer solstice, we got these little puny plants. We have mostly bare ground, these little puny plants. Perennial system is like full on, taking all that sun, creating biomass, creating food, putting out roots, just like we're rocking by the solstice, whereas annual crops are not. And we're talking about sequestering carbon, of course. So this can be like a little tiny thing. This is a little pear tree in my yard. And this little polyculture just found itself. That elecampane used to be growing all over my yard, and I was like mowing it back, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's happy around the pear tree. Look at that. It covers all the weeds. It's got really deep tap roots, so it brings all this nutrients up. It's a nutrient pump. All those leaves drop. Sometimes I just chop it with my scythe and lay it down, and then it'll grow back again. And it has flowers that come late, and they're in that with those pears, so that when the pear tree is long done, those pollinators still have to have stuff. So our polycultures always want to have flowers for the pollinators. So elecampane's doing that. It's also a medicinal herb. The pear tree is holding up those flowers, which usually just flop to the ground because they lodge in the wind. So there's like a nice mutual benefit there. And this is like a simple little polyculture that yields a lot of pears with no work. The elecampane's basically doing a lot of the work for me. It's another, whoops, where's Ben? Come on, back one. This is another little polyculture. This is my favorite permaculture plant right here. It's called wild garden chicory. It's basically the ditchweed chicory mixed with crossbred with a bunch of Italian chicories. And this will grow out of your lawn, basically. This will grow anywhere. You can't really get rid of it. It self-seeds. It performs we're always talking about stacking functions. This plant performs I don't even know how many functions. I'm going to just read them off real quick because I can't remember. So the blue one, okay? That's a biennial plant. It's edible. The leaves are edible. The roots are used for food. It's a nectary plant it's medicinal. It's an amazing bee plant. All morning long, this thing will be covered with bees. It's great fodder for chickens. You can make a beverage out of the roots. The taproot is bringing nutrients up just like the other stuff. You can use it for mulch. It can create biomass for your compost. You can make medicine. Comfrey, chicory roots can be used as medicine. Tea, and you don't have to do anything. It just does its thing all the time for you. The other one, no, is dill. Yeah. I know the wild parsnip out here. I've heard the horror stories. I've seen the horror stories. Yeah, I've kind of lost my love affair with parsnips after I kind of started coming to Iowa. No, that's dill, and the dill self-seeds and comes back. And between these two, this is the chicory's got all the bees going on, and the dill's got all the hoverflies and little parasitic wasps and stuff. And it's, they're both, dill's great herb, and the seeds are great. And so that's just a little polyculture that just does its thing. And and when the snow melts, the chicory is basically there, and it just starts coming because it's a biennial. They're in the ground, ready to go, and then the birds come and get them in the fall. The goldfinches will be a flock of them that will come out of that patch every year. So very functional. This is always the first stop on our field trip. This is the Seed Savers Exchange. Oh, you know what I wanted to do? I just missed my chance when we were talking about the food forest. You guys are probably getting glazed over a little bit. I just wanted to talk about trees for a second, but I want you guys to talk to each other about trees for just 1 minute. Question, where do trees come from? Like, where do they get how do they get to be these huge things? And no cheating, no telling the answers. No, just like, you put a chestnut in the ground and this giant tree is there 100 years later. Where did it come from? It feeds the soil. Talk amongst yourselves. Just pick somebody next to you and just talk for 1 minute and talk about where trees come from. I can take a break. All right, how are you guys doing? I think everybody at least woke back up. So what are trees made of? Energy. Sun.
Water.
From the moon. Trees are made from air. Trees are made from air. CO2, photosynthesis just does that thing, and it takes the carbon off and spits out the oxygen. Watch this little video by Richard Feynman called Trees Are Made from Air. It's really entertaining. He's a trip. Anyway, just thought I like to do that. Gotta wake people up. So we start our field trips at Seed Savers Exchange because the plants that we're going to need for the food revolution that we need to have come from our genetic heritage, and we've been breeding these plants for 10,000 years, and this genetic heritage is being trashed really fast. And I've seen it happen with seed companies where a seed company buys another seed company, and 80% of what they buy, it's like, well, they don't really sell that good. We'll get rid of those, and we'll get rid of these. And our genetic heritage is being, there's some alarming statistics out there which I don't really buy into because I think the genes are still out there. But these varieties, these named varieties, are gone. Lots and lots of them. So Seed Savers Exchange is doing all this work to preserve our genetic heritage, and it's really cool. Students get to go in their seed room where there's like, what did Phil say? 23,000 varieties of cultivars of plants in there. It's a lot of stuff. And then they have this like their own little doomsday vault. They're also clonally propagating 720 varieties of potato and eliminating virus from it, doing that in-house, which they've never done before. There's 720 potato varieties right there in tissue culture. So students get to check out that stuff. Then we always go to Roald Gunderson's place. Some of you may know Roald. He's responsible for those giant trees that are in the SL building. And he talks a lot about that forest ecology, and he's been caring for this forest, since he was a kid, really, and living in this forest. Takes the students up, and we're actually helping him eradicate his wild mustard out of his forest, and making incredible strides, really. This year he had very little. A lot of it had to do maybe with the winter weather, but when we were there the first time, he was very much up in arms because his whole forest was taken over by garlic mustard.
Goats love it.
Yeah, he could use some goats there for sure. He's not there permanent, like he's only there part of the time, so But yeah, he's teaching the students about how he manages the forest. And if you look at this forest, it doesn't look like a very valuable forest, right? It's all kind of curvy, funky stuff. Well, Roald's been looking at these trees for a long time, and there was a big wind event there that blew a lot of trees, and they all had these curves. And he's developed this whole form of architecture called whole tree architecture. This is where we get to stay. It's pretty magical. And he's built all kinds of things. They've done work with, I believe it's a USDA on structurally testing round wood, much, much stronger than squared up timbers. And he's developed all these techniques to build with round wood, and it sequesters a lot of carbon because there's no embodied energy in that stuff. You just take the tree, peel it, and you build with it. You don't have to cart it to a sawmill, saw it, bring it back. Very low carbon, very beautiful, very artistic, pretty cool stuff. This is Philip Rudder, Badger Set Research Farm. This guy has literally written the book on hybrid hazelnuts, and he will tell you that anything you can do with a soybean, you can do with a hazelnut, as well as preserve, build soil, sequester carbon, right down the line.
Is that you or is that?
That's Phil Hawes. That's TC right there. No, this guy here, that's Phil Rudder. He's the hazelnut guy. And he also has chestnuts and northern pecans.
Is that in Iowa?
This is in Minnesota. This is his nursery where he does his breeding work, oddly enough, built by Roald Gunderson, built this greenhouse. And so he's been breeding these hazelnuts to be like more productive, more of a size that can be machine harvested. And a lot of his genetics now are like all over the place. Other people have taken his genetics and they're just breeding him and breeding him. And he's doing this at scale, and he's trying to dial this in to be mechanized. Unfortunately, no money goes to this research. Our farm bill is just subsidizing large-scale monoculture agriculture, and nobody is funding this. The guy is broke. He's bitter and broke at this point, and he's done this incredible service for humanity. He's got this vision of like changing the entire Midwest to food forest using hazelnuts and animals and hardly any inputs, and using these little machines to harvest this stuff. But it's not getting a lot of traction.
Has he written a book?
He has. It's called The Hybrid Hazelnut. He sure has. Like I said, he has literally written the book. This is one of his fields, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember which nut tree that is, but it's being grazed by sheep. So no, he doesn't mow anything on his property. It's all done by grazing animals. This next place, this is one of the reasons why when Phil Hawes called me up 2 years ago and said, hey, I just agreed to teach permaculture at this place called the Maharishi University, and I'm not too sure about teaching this class. You want to come help? And I had to Google up and see where I was going. I'm like, okay, Phil, this sounds really cool. But I'm only going to come out if we can go visit Mark Shepard, who's 4 hours away. This guy wrote another book called Restoration Agriculture, and it's a brilliant book. It really paints a picture of how we can transform the entire soybean corn monoculture into a giant food forest. So this is his wife, Jen. Mark will never come out and talk to us because he's always so busy. But Jen loves to give us tours. This is the design that they did. And boy, this thing's a little fussy. This is the classic picture. Notice there's no straight lines here. It's not because it looks cool. This is water harvesting. This is something, he practices something called keyline water harvesting. And all of these things are laid out on contour so that he can move water through his landscape and no water leaves his landscape. So with all these extreme weather events, he's keeping that water on the land. And also, he never has bare ground. I mean, not never. He has little bits of bare ground, but rarely does he bare his ground. And he planted 10,000 chestnut trees. And he planted them very close together. And he is doing the opposite thing with resistance, where he's going through his trees and he's finding the ones that have resistance and taking out the other ones. And he's taking those seeds and planting them and growing more trees and finding more and more resistance. And now he's got resistant strains of chestnut. So the same science used in this crazy herbicide-resistant GMO stuff can be used for mass selection breeding. Same exact idea, except this is for the good, not for, not chasing our tail on resistance to herbicides. So he's in Wisconsin, I can't remember the... Viroqua, thank you. You were there, yeah. Mark Shepard. This kind of shows, shows the keyline plan. This is what he calls a little pocket pond. These aren't really ponds, they're little dams. So when that water comes ripping through his farm, it hits these dams and then it just runs out through these big swales, these alleys. So he's moving water from this low part out to the high parts. It's kind of magic, but it's really not, because the water's still flowing downhill, but you can take the water from the valleys, put it out on the ridges, just by a little earthworks. And this is that transitional ethic. He used bulldozers to do this. He didn't go out there with a pick and shovel. He transformed 110 acres. One time, bunch of machines, and he's done. And now this is going to harvest water forever. No pumping. Here, these are Korean nut pines out there. It's a crop he's been experimenting with. He's also got a heritage apple orchard, much like they have up at Seed Savers Exchange, where he's just conserving all heritage apple varieties. He uses daffodils for pest control to keep the voles from chewing on the trees, plant daffodils around him. This is an alley of his chestnuts now that he's thinned out. And the nature mimic that Mark Shepard's after is called the savanna mimic, which has much less trees. This is not a closed canopy food forest. This is a savanna mimic, so lots of open area. Maybe he'll have, a 50 to 70%, cover. When these trees get really huge, it actually would probably close out eventually, although there are areas where the trees aren't so close together. And he uses grazing animals and pigs and chickens and all kinds of animals on his land to do all the mowing and fertilizing as well. So that's savanna, where you would have wild animals grazing, like in Africa. You've got trees and grasses and animals. This is the same idea. He also can do row cropping in between these alleys when these trees are small like this. So he's tilling up ground to do. He actually leases his land to other people to come grow annual crops like squash or whatever. And you can kind of see where we are here. We're just right in the middle of this, That's a desert. That's a biological desert. You walk down into that valley down in there and you think you're in like the Garden of Eden. There's food everywhere. There's rabbits running around. There's birds. There's bugs. There's butterflies. There's like an entire ecosystem, an edible ecosystem in there. You step out there, it's 10 degrees hotter. It's dry. It's dusty. It's full of chemicals. It's like a nasty place. It's like no brainer. Why aren't we doing more of this?
Does he have wild chickens?
He doesn't have wild chickens that I ever saw. There's a little fence there for pigs. He's gonna keep pigs on one side of that fence. They were getting ready to bring some grazers in there that spring. This is what it could look like when those chestnut trees get bigger. This is not Mark Shepard's place. I've never seen cows, but he grazes cows out there. This is silvopasture. We saw the coolest video when we were at Will Crombie's place about silvopasture. It was a conventional beef farmer just opened up a whole bunch of his land that was just scrubby forest and like impenetrable, brought goats in, cleared it out, started planting grass, grazing cattle in there, and the guy is like beside himself on what he's done to his farm. Brought it back to life, bringing the soils back to life. His soil carbon is going up. His cows are way happier because they have shade. It's done in it's mob grazing. They do these in small paddocks. It mimics a natural system where animals would always be packed up because they were being chased by wolves. They were being chased by hunters. They always would run in packs and move quickly, take a bite, move on. That's what the mimic is. If you turn animals out, if anybody's ever seen Alan Savory's video, they shot 50,000 elephants in Africa before they figured this out, because you couldn't just leave them out there. You had to move them. So they could move elephants in packs and they would not damage the land because they would bite, move, and stimulate the ground. And now they realize that they didn't have to kill all those animals. And so the stocking rates can actually go up if you pack the animals up and move them in these rotational systems. And if you do it under trees, it's even better because you're sequestering carbon in the trees. You can grow more grass in 20% shade than you can grow out in the open. Have you ever seen your lawn, like when it get a little droughty, all that nice green grass under the tree and everything else is all scorched? You can get that same effect in a silvopasture model. So we went back in the fall to Mark Shepard's place. This is a new crew. And we went out there, and you can see how different it looks. It's how much more lush it is after a growing season. We found all these Asian pears and apples. We were just feasting all the way along, and then we always do a service learning kind of thing. Whenever we go visit somebody, we try to help them out a little bit. And we harvested chestnuts for Jen because Mark was off talking and writing books, and she had lots of chestnuts that needed to get harvested, so we harvested 30, 40 gallons of chestnuts. And we pocketed a whole bunch, and we ate a whole bunch. And, but we had a blast harvesting chestnuts, and they're so beautiful. It's such an abundant, amazing crop. And they're powering the whole farm on renewable energy besides. This was another really compelling place that we went. This was the Roque. Remember Roque? The orchard? They had like 17, they had their orchard all set up in these little paddocks, and the trees very widely spaced. All their fertility and grazing was done with animals. They would clear their paddocks with pigs. They had this beautiful windbreak that was all poplar trees, and this is something we talk about a lot in permaculture. These are dynamic systems, right? You have to plan for succession. So after these poplar trees started growing, they put those blue spruces in between, and now they're harvesting all the poplar and they're growing mushrooms on it. They gave us, I don't know how many pounds of shiitake mushrooms we ended up taking out of there. But they're like, yeah, take whatever you want, we're done with them. They had like 100 pounds of shiitakes just sitting out there. So now we're getting to our last little spot. This is where we just were. This is the guy you're going to hear next Thursday or Wednesday. This is Reginaldo Haslet Marroquin. He's a Guatemalan refugee, really. He was in Guatemala. He grew up in Guatemala, and he was there during the Great Genocide in Guatemala, and he knows guerrilla tactics. And I really like the fact that he's on our team. One of my students, when he spoke to our class, he started talking about this revolution, how we're going to take back agriculture from the man and the corporations, and this model's going to grow in our communities, and we're going to take this all back. And one of my students is like, hey, what's going to happen when they find out about this? And he's like, oh, don't worry. We won't take them on in the open. We'll just hit and run. We'll make them come to us, and we will win because we have the truth. And I was like, Viva la Revolución! I love this guy. But Ray has developed this model of regenerative, poultry-based regenerative agriculture, and it is so incredibly simple. He showed us a couple of videos. He took an hour to talk to our class. We didn't even know if we were going to see the guy. He was just so gracious, and he's just brilliant in so many ways. He started the Main Street Project. He's also the driving force behind Regeneration International and the driving force behind Regeneration Midwest. He's got this vision for regenerating agriculture around the world, and he knows what it looks like because he grew up in it. He grew up in a food forest. He grew up with chickens living under a canopy, and that's what chickens want to do. They want their jungle fowl. They want to live under a canopy. So he explains this model. He's got these paddocks, 2 paddocks, a chicken barn, and a little chicken sunroom. And, come on, these are his birds. He grows 2,000 to 3,000 birds in one round. He can grow meat birds in the system, or he can grow egg layers. Meat birds are there for 120 days. They're longer than the traditional, like those other crazy looking white things that can not even walk after 7 or 8 weeks. These are like happy. These chickens came running over to see us, and they're like super happy, living a pure chicken existence, right? The permaculture design, any element you put in that design, you want to provide the opportunity for that thing to live its essence, to become its true self. These chickens are living their true chicken self. They're so happy. Not to mention, they're growing this incredible crop of hazelnuts. He gets twice as many hazelnuts per bush as conventional hazelnut farms. He gets 5 pounds of hazelnuts from every one of these things because the chickens are doing all the work. They're doing all the weeding, all the fertilizing. He grows traditional, this is like corn from Oaxaca. It's like the Center of Diversity for Corn. He goes these traditional corn in there. He goes sunflowers. He has elderberries. He has oak trees, and he has apple trees, all in this, and it's all being driven by chickens.
And where is it?
This is in Northfield, Minnesota. So he could just grow hazelnuts and use all kinds of fossil fuels and chemicals to do it, or he can make the chickens do all the work. And the chickens really are almost a byproduct of this work, right? But we're going to eat those chickens. He's going to eat those chickens. They're called tree-range chickens. And they have a marketing campaign. That guy, the other guy in that photograph, that guy over there in the corner, that's Will Crombie. That guy's a genius. He is a communicator. He knows how to do video. He's also a farmer. He's growing. He's got the organic compound where we stayed. He's growing. He's doing this thing. He's going to change. He's a game changer. He feeds the chickens. So the chickens eat. They forage on the grass in the paddocks. You can see this paddock's pretty spent at this point. These chickens no longer exist as in this form. Yes, they feed them sprouted grains, and they can even do this in the dead of winter. They sprout the grains and then they freeze them, and they call it a grain sickle. And they put it in there, and it's really good for the chickens because chickens that eat dry grain in the winter, they have a hard time because they have to drink, and they don't tend to want to drink because it's not hot, so they eat these grain sickles. And then they take all the manure from the paddocks and they put it in the fields to grow the grain to come back and feed the chickens, and then they get extra energy out of that, and they grow other stuff with it as well. It's another little view. You can kind of see this little food forest that the chickens are so happy in. This is the other paddock that he had just taken them out of 2 weeks before, and you can see it's already regenerating like crazy. So when he starts this up again in the spring, this is going to be charging hard with grass and stuff. This is their little sunroom. So when it's a rainy day, like this was at Will's, when it's a rainy day, the chickens can be out in their sunroom and not be stuck in their dark little place.
How does he feed the chickens in the winter?
The grain sickles.
Okay, so
He just dumps them out in the sunroom, and then the chickens can just peck at that and get their water and their food from the grain sickles. This is a lousy photograph because it was pouring rain. This entire field trip we just went on was brutally cold and wet. But we were intrepid, and we went down to see Will Crombie, that guy, has planted 23,000 hazelnuts on his land. And he is going to take that same machine that Phil Rutter was using, and in 6 or 8 years, he's going to be producing thousands and thousands of pounds of hazelnuts to demonstrate. And the Main Street Project is doing the same thing. He's got 40-something acres, I think, in hazelnuts, 42 acres.
you talked about the animals.
Yeah. So far, in places they're caging things, they're fencing things. He doesn't seem to have a lot of deer pressure there because he's surrounded by nothing but corn and soy for like forever, so there's not a lot of deer pressure. But they're going to have other pressures. Squirrels, yeah, it's going to be interesting. But he's like, I don't know if this is going to work. I mean, this is all, permaculture is observe, interact, observe, interact. We observe what's going on, we try to mimic, things go wrong, we make a move. Somebody's got to do this before we figure out how to do it. You know, Phil Rutter just gave 40 years of his life to it. These guys are doing the same thing. There's people all over the Midwest doing this, all over the world, putting themselves on the line to create new systems to fight this thing. You want to come up here and talk about these pigs?
Sure. They were really friendly. They would just come up to us and, I don't know, just start rubbing. Really puppy.
They were the happiest pigs you have ever seen.
They were really sweet.
We were coming, see that little trailer up there in the corner? We were just miserable, right? We were just so miserable out there in this freezing cold rain. We come walking around the corner, we hear all this clanging, like what the heck is going on? Here come these pigs charging, they're like spinning rubber in this trailer, and they come charging out and run over to us, and they literally look like little 300-pound puppies. They were like running on their backs and rubbing their tummies, and they're just, it was crazy. They also no longer exist in this form. Just saying. So again, we give back. So those pigs, in spite of being like, or besides being like super cute and living this happy pig existence, they were as happy as pigs in a poke. And they tilled up 3/4 of an acre of land for Will during the summer, and they fertilized it and they weeded it and they did all that stuff. So he's got all this cleared land back there. Our students, part of this ecosystem, came in, took I don't know how many bulbs of garlic, a few, like 1,000 or two bulbs of garlic, and turned it into many thousands of cloves of garlic, because Will is the largest garlic grower in Minnesota. He plants 3/4 of an acre of garlic, which gives him about 25,000 bulbs, which in Minnesota he's the biggest guy. And he's going to plant that where the pigs just were. Thanks to all of these guys that did a round robin for 3 hours, like 4 or 5 people for 3 hours to make that work happen, and that was awesome. So that's my story, that's our thing. Whoops. Oh, and by the way, you can do this in the middle of a city. That's Brooklyn, New York. I actually edited that out, but it can be done anywhere. Thanks for your attention. It took a long time. Thanks.